Fast Asleep with Gina Marie. Hello, everybody. Hey, tell me, what will you be doing today while you listen to, not one, but two amazing classic stories? I'm Gina. No, Marie is not my dog. Nope. I really want to know, what are you going to be doing while you're listening? Drifting off to sleep? Nice. Taking a walk? Ooh, good. Climbing a mountain? Be careful. Washing your car? Oh, that's a good one. Tell me. The ball's in your court. Hey, I guess you all love that Stephen King story. Me too. Silly, I know, but fun. And we're going to have to be following up with more Stephen King. Thanks for all those comments. I can't tell you how happy I am to bring you today's stories. They are both from a genuine Dick. Philip K. Dick, the author, of course. What'd you think? Anyway, Philip Kindred Dick, sometimes referred to as PKD, and you can understand why, was an American science and speculative fiction writer. He was considered one of the most important figures of 20th century science fiction, with 44 novels and 121 short stories written in only 30 years. His works spawned Ridley Scott's 1982 film Blade Runner, the 1990 movie Total Recall, and at least 8 other significant films. Today you're going to hear his very first published story. He was born in 1928, and Dick has been said to have a startling ability to foreshadow the modern world. Well, he predicted that one day companies would directly, and I mean directly, target and communicate with their potential consumers, already precisely knowing their preferences. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Though born in Chicago, he moved to San Francisco with his family as a young boy. He had a twin sister, and they were born 6 weeks prematurely, not uncommon, but his twin sister died just 6 weeks after their birth. And her loss apparently affected Philip throughout his life. And like many of our classic story authors, his parents divorced when he was very young. Same. Dick attended the University of California at Berkeley, great school, for 2 months. He dropped out because of anxiety and the mandatory ROTC training. Now, that's according to his third wife. There were actually 5 wives for Dick and 3 children. Philip K. Dick struggled with mental health. He called himself a flipped-out freak. He called amphetamines his happiness pills. He also called them his nightmare pills. Most of his work was written under their influence. So not surprisingly, he dealt with hallucinations. In the 1970s, he delved into mystical experiences. He believed a woman shot him with a pink beam of light, after which he believed he was clairvoyant and also living in more than one time period. Needless to say, he wasn't easy to live with. There were physical fights with those wives, death threats, and even suicide attempts. But from the time of his very first published short story, 1951, age 22, he was able to write full-time. And he won the Hugo Award in 1963 for his very first novel, The Man in the High Castle, while critics hailed him a genius. Oh, there were other awards, too, including more Hugos. After complaining of failing eyesight, he was found unconscious in his Orange County, California home in 1982. He had suffered a stroke and was taken to the hospital where he suffered another stroke. He died 5 days later. Philip is buried next to his twin sister. His death occurred only 4 months before the release of Blade Runner. He was 53 years old. Okay, that's a lot of heaviness to take in, I know. So it may be surprising to hear that these two stories are very light, actually delightful. Tell me what you think. The first was published in 1953. Tuck in, everybody. From Philip K. Dick. The Eyes Have It. It was quite by accident I discovered this incredible invasion of Earth by life forms from another planet. As yet, I haven't done anything about it. I can't think of anything to do. I wrote to the government, and they sent back a pamphlet on the repair and maintenance of frame houses. Anyhow, the whole thing is known. I'm not the first to discover it. Maybe it's even under control. I was sitting in my easy chair, idly turning the pages of a paperbacked book someone had left on the bus when I came across the reference that first put me on the trail. For a moment, I didn't respond. It took some time for the full import to sink in. After I'd comprehended, it seemed odd I hadn't noticed it right away. The reference was clearly to a non-human species of incredible properties, not indigenous to Earth. A species, I hasten to point out, customarily masquerading as ordinary human beings. Their disguise, however, became transparent in the face of the following observations by the author. It was at once obvious the author knew everything, and was taking it in his stride. Oh, the line. And I tremble remembering it even now. Read. His eyes slowly roved about the room. Vague chills assailed me. I tried to picture the eyes. Did they roll like dimes? The passage indicated not. They seemed to move through the air, not over the surface. Rather rapidly, apparently. No one in the story was surprised. That's what tipped me off. No sign of amazement at such an outrageous thing. Later, the matter was amplified. His eyes moved from person to person. There it was, in a nutshell. The eyes had clearly come apart from the rest of him and were on their own. My heart pounded and my breath choked in my windpipe. I had stumbled on an accidental mention of a totally unfamiliar race, obviously non-terrestrial. Yet, to the characters in the book, it was perfectly natural, which suggested they belonged to the same species. And the author, a slow suspicion burned in my mind. The author was taking it rather too easily in his stride. Evidently, he felt this was quite a usual thing. He made absolutely no attempt to conceal this knowledge. The story continued. Presently, his eyes fastened on Julia. Julia, being a lady, had at least the breeding to feel indignant. She is described as blushing and knitting her brows angrily. Oh, at this I sighed with relief. They weren't all non-terrestrials. The narrative continued. Slowly, calmly, his eyes examined every inch of her. Great Scott! But here the girl turned and stomped off, and the matter ended. I lay back in my chair, gasping with horror. My wife and family regarded me in wonder. "What's wrong, dear?" my wife asked. I couldn't tell her. Knowledge like this was too much for the ordinary run-of-the-mill person. I had to keep it to myself. "Nothing," I gasped. I leaped up, snatched the book, and hurried out of the room. In the garage, I continued reading. Oh, there was more. Trembling, I read the next revealing passage. He put his arm around Julia. Presently, she asked him if he would remove his arm. He immediately did so, with a smile. It's not said what was done with the arm after the fellow had removed it. Maybe it was left standing upright in the corner. Maybe it was thrown away. I don't care. In any case, the full meaning was there, staring me right in the face. Here was a race of creatures capable of removing portions of their anatomy at will, eyes, arms, and maybe more, without batting an eyelash. My knowledge of biology came in handy at this point. Obviously, they were simple beings, unicellular, some sort of primitive, single-celled things, being no more developed than starfish. Starfish can do the same thing, you know. I read on, and came to this incredible revelation, tossed off coolly by the author without the faintest tremor. Outside the movie theater, we split up. Part of us went inside, part over to the cafe for dinner. Binary fission, of course, splitting in half and forming two entities. Probably each lower half went to the cafe, it being farther, and the upper halves to the movies. I read on, hands shaking. Oh, I had really stumbled onto something here. My mind reeled as I made out this passage. I'm afraid there's no doubt about it. Poor Bibney has lost his head again. Which was followed by, and Bob says he has utterly no guts. Oh, yeah. Yet Bibney got around as well as the next person. The next person, however, was just as strange. He was soon described as totally lacking in brains. There was no doubt of the thing in the next passage. Julia, whom I had thought to be the one normal person, reveals herself as also being an alien life form, similar to the rest. Quite deliberately, Julia had given her heart to the young man. It didn't relate what the final disposition of the organ was, but I didn't really care. It was evident Julia had gone right on living in her usual manner, like all the others in the book, without heart, arms, eyes, brains, viscera, dividing up in two when the occasion demanded, without a qualm. Thereupon, she gave him her hand. I sickened. The rascal now had her hand as well as her heart. I shuddered to think what he'd done with them by this time. He took her arm. Not content to wait, he had to start dismantling her on his own. Flushing crimson, I slammed the book shut and leaped to my feet, but not in time to escape one last reference to those carefree bits of anatomy whose travels had originally thrown me on the track. Her eyes followed him all the way down the road and across the meadow. I rushed from the garage and back inside the warm house, as if the accursed things were following me. My wife and children were playing Monopoly in the kitchen. I joined them and played with frantic fervor, brow feverish, teeth chattering. I had had enough of the thing. I want to hear no more about it. Oh, let them come on. Let them invade Earth. I don't want to get mixed up in it. I have absolutely no stomach for it. Stay with me. I'll be right back with another from Philip K. Dick. And now, I would like to dedicate this next story to my neighbor's dog, for obvious reasons. It's time to tuck in just a little bit more, everybody. Published in 1951 for Philip K. Dick's Roog. Roog! The dog said. He rested his paws on the top of the fence and looked around him. The Roog came running into the yard. It was early morning, and the sun had not really come up yet. The air was cold and gray, and the walls of the house were damp with moisture. The dog opened his jaws a little as he watched, his big black paws clutching the wood of the fence. The Roog stood by the open gate, looking into the yard. He was a small Rug, thin and white, on wobbly legs. The Rug blinked at the dog, and the dog showed his teeth. "Rug," he said again. The sound echoed into the silent half-darkness. Nothing moved, nor stirred. The dog dropped down and walked back across the yard to the porch steps. He sat down on the bottom step and watched the Rug. The Rug glanced at him, then he stretched his neck up to the window of the house. Just above him, he sniffed at the window. Oh, the dog came flashing across the yard. He hit the fence and the gate shuddered and groaned. The Rug was walking quickly up the path, hurrying with funny little mincing steps. The dog lay down against the slats of the gate, breathing heavily, his red tongue hanging. He watched the Rug disappear. The dog lay silently, his eyes bright and black. The day was beginning to come. The sky turned a little whiter, and from all around the sounds of people echoed through the morning air. Lights popped on behind shades. In the chilly dawn, a window was opened. The dog did not move. He watched the path. In the kitchen, Mrs. Cardissy poured water into the coffee pot. Steam rose from the water, blinding her. She set the pot down on the edge of the stove and went into the pantry. When she came back, Alf was standing at the door of the kitchen. He put his glasses on.
You bring the paper?"
he said. "It's outside." Alf Cardissy walked across the kitchen. He threw the bolt on the back door and stepped out onto the porch. He looked into the gray, damp morning. At the fence, Boris lay, black and furry, his tongue out.
"Put the tongue in,"
Alf said. The dog looked quickly up. His tail beat against the ground.
"The tongue,"
Alf said.
"Put the tongue in."
The dog and the man looked at one another. The dog whined. His eyes were bright and feverish.
"Rug,"
he said, softly.
"What?"
Alf looked around.
"Someone coming? Paper boy come?"
The dog stared at him, his mouth open.
You certainly upset these days,"
Alf said.
"You better take it easy. We're both getting too old for excitement."
He went inside the house. The sun came up. The street became bright and alive with color. The postman went along the sidewalk with his letters and magazines. Some children hurried by, laughing and talking. About 11, Mrs. Cardissy swept the front porch. She sniffed the air, pausing for a moment. It smells good today," she said. "That means it's going to be warm." In the heat of the noonday sun, the black dog lay stretched out full length under the porch. His chest rose and fell. In the cherry tree, the birds were playing, squawking and chattering to each other. Once in a while, Boris raised his head and looked at them. Presently, he got to his feet and trotted down under the tree. He was standing under the tree when he saw the two Rugs sitting on the fence, watching him.
He's big," the first Rug said. "Most guardians aren't as big as this."
The other Rug nodded, his head wobbling on his neck. Boris watched them without moving, his body stiff and hard. The Rugs were silent now, looking at the big dog with his shaggy ruff of white around his neck.
How is the offering urn?
The first Roog said.
Is it almost full?
Yeah, the other nodded. It's almost ready.
You there,
the first Roog said, raising his voice.
You hear me? Well, we've decided to accept the offering this time. So, you remember to let us in, and no nonsense now.
Yeah, don't forget, the other added. It won't be long. Boris said nothing. The two Roogs leaped off the fence and went over together just beyond the walk. One of them brought out a map, and they studied it.
Now, this area really is none too good for a first trial,
the first Roog said.
There's too many guardians. Now, the north side area.
Yeah, they decided, the other Roog said. There are so many factors.
Of course.
They glanced at Boris and moved back farther from the fence. He could not hear the rest of what they were saying. Presently, the Roogs put their map away and went off down the path. Boris walked over to the fence and sniffed at the boards. He smelled the sickly, rotten odor of Roogs, and the hair stood up on his back. That night, when Alf Cardassie came home, the dog was standing at the gate, looking up the walk. Alf opened the gate and went into the yard.
Oh, how are you?
He said, thumping the dog's side.
Now you stop worrying? It seems like you've been nervous of late. You didn't used to be that way.
Boris whined, looking intently up into the man's face.
You're a good dog, Boris, Alf said. You're pretty big, too, for a dog. You don't remember long ago how you used to be only a little bit of a puppy.
Boris leaned against the man's leg.
Yeah, you're a good dog, Alf murmured. I just wish I knew what is on your mind.
He went inside the house. Mrs. Cardassie was setting the table for dinner. Alf went into the living room and took his coat and hat off. He set his lunch pail down on the sideboard and came back into the kitchen. Oh, what's the matter? Mrs. Cardassie said.
It's that dog. He's got to stop making all that noise, barking. The neighbor's going to complain to the police again.
Oh, I hope we don't have to give him to your brother, Mrs. Cardassie said, folding her arms. But he sure goes crazy, especially on Friday morning when the garbage men come.
Well, maybe he'll calm down,
Alf said. He lit his pipe and smoked solemnly.
He didn't used to be that way. Maybe he'll get better, like he was.
We'll see, Mrs. Cardassie said. The sun rose up, cold and ominous. Mist hung over all the trees and in the low places. It was Friday morning. The black dog lay under the porch, listening, his eyes wide and staring. His coat was stiff with hoarfrost, and the breath from his nostrils made clouds of steam in the thin air. Suddenly, he turned his head and leaped up. From far off, a long way away, a faint sound came, a kind of crashing sound.
"Oh!"
Boris cried, looking around. He hurried to the gate and stood up, his paws on top of the fence. In the distance, the sound came again, louder now, not as far away as before. It was a crashing, clanging sound, as if something were being rolled back, as if a great door were being opened.
"Rug!"
Boris cried. He stared up, anxiously, at the darkened windows above him. Nothing stirred. Nothing. And along the street, the Rugs came. The Rugs and their truck moved along, bouncing against the rough stones, crashing and whirring.
"Rug!"
Boris cried, and he leaped, his eyes blazing. And then he became more calm. He settled himself down on the ground and waited, listening. Out in front, the Rugs stopped their truck. He could hear them opening the doors, stepping down onto the sidewalk. Boris ran around in a little circle. He whined, and his muzzle turned once again toward the house. Inside the warm, dark bedroom, Mr. Cardasy sat up a little in bed and squinted at the clock.
"Oh, that damn dog,"
he muttered.
"That damn dog."
He turned his face toward the pillow and closed his eyes. The Rugs were coming down the path now. The first Rug pushed against the gate, and the gate opened. The Rugs came into the yard. The dog backed away from them.
"Rug! Rug!"
he cried. That horrid, bitter smell of Rugs came into his nose, and he turned away.
"The offering urn,"
the first Rug said.
"It's full, I think."
He smiled at the rigid, angry dog.
"Oh, how very good of you,"
he said. The Rugs came toward the metal can, and one of them took the lid from it.
"Rug! Rug!"
Boris cried, huddled against the bottom of the porch steps. His body shook with horror. The Rugs were lifting up the big metal can, turning it on its side. The contents poured out onto the ground, and the Rugs scooped the sacks of bulging, splitting paper together, catching at the orange peels and fragments of the bits of toast and eggshells. One of the Rugs popped an eggshell into his mouth. His teeth crunched the eggshell.
"Rug!"
Boris cried, hopelessly, almost to himself. The Rugs were almost finished with their work of gathering up the offering. They stopped for a moment, looking at Boris, and then, slowly, silently, the Rugs looked up the side of the house, along the stucco to the window, with its brown shade pulled tightly down.
"Rug!"
Boris screamed, and he came toward them, dancing with fury and dismay. Reluctantly, the Rugs turned away from the window, and they went out through the gate, closing it behind them.
"Ah, look at him,"
the last Rug said with contempt, pulling his corner of the blanket up on his shoulder. Boris strained against the fence, his mouth open, snapping wildly. The biggest Rug began to wave his arms furiously, and Boris retreated. He settled down at the bottom of the porch steps, his mouth still open. And from the depths of him an unhappy, terrible moan issued forth, a wail of misery and despair.
"Ah, come on,"
the other Rug said to the lingering Rug at the fence. They walked up the path.
"Well, except for these little places around the Guardians, this area is well cleared,"
the biggest Rug said.
"and I'll be glad when this particular Guardian is done. He certainly causes us a lot of trouble.
Don't be impatient,
one of the Roogs said. He grinned.
Our truck is full enough as it is. Let's leave something for next week.
The Roogs laughed. They went on up the path, carrying the offering in the dirty, sagging blanket. Introduction information for today's episode is from Philip K. Dick, The Writer Who Witnessed the Future, by Adam Scoville, features correspondent for the BBC, and other sources in our show notes. Music for this episode is Elegy for Peace from Felix Roche, Father and Son, S-U-N, from Martin Herzberg, The Streets of Belgrade from Infinity Ripple, and Run from Ludovico Einaudi. Contact me whenever you like, and you can right here in comments, or email me at fastasleepwithginamarie44@gmail.com, or on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. We'll be here, right here, for you, as long as you remember to review, to like, to comment. Please follow us and subscribe. We thank you for listening. And our key word, offering. And don't forget about next week. Next week we have a visit from Miss Marple. Good night.